I thought I was just another face in the crowd at my neighbor's daughter's wedding, just a quiet guest in a simple dress. But everything changed the moment the bride's mother, draped in diamonds and pride, walked up to me, and in front of 100 stunned witnesses, slapped me across the face and called me a nobody. What she didn't know is that I'm the last person she should have humiliated. Before we uncover the truth behind that moment, the slap, the silence, and the storm that followed, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. Because what happened next didn't just expose her ignorance, it turned the entire wedding upside down. Let me tell you exactly what happened that day. My name is Riley, and I live what most people would call an ordinary life. I wake up in my small one-bedroom apartment every morning, make my coffee in the same chipped mug I've had for years, and go about my day quietly. I don't draw attention to myself. I don't make waves. I'm the kind of person you might pass on the street without a second glance. And honestly, I prefer it that way. I've lived in the same building for 3 years now, and while I know my neighbors well enough to smile and say hello, we're not exactly close. There's Mrs. Patterson from 3B, who always complains about the noise even when there isn't any. There's Kyle Benson from downstairs who plays his music too loud on weekends. And then there's the Rodriguez family from across the hall, Sophia, her husband Mateo, and their daughter Jasmine. The Rodriguez family has always been kind to me. Sophia would sometimes bring me leftover tamales when she made too many, and Mateo would help me carry groceries up the stairs when my hands were full. Their daughter Jasmine was a sweet girl in her early 20s, always polite, always smiling. She was getting married to her college sweetheart, a young man named Ethan who seemed to adore her. So when I found the cream-colored envelope slipped under my door one Tuesday evening, I was genuinely surprised. My name was written in elegant script across the front, Miss Riley. And inside was a beautiful wedding invitation. Jasmine was inviting me to her wedding. Me, the quiet neighbor who barely spoke more than a few words to her each month. I held that invitation in my hands for a long time, reading it over and over. Someone had thought of me. Someone had wanted me there on their special day. It had been so long since I'd felt included. I called Sophia the next day to confirm, and she sounded genuinely happy that I would be attending. "Of course we want you there," she said in her warm voice. "You're part of our little family here, part of their family." Those words meant more to me than she could have known. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at some fancy venue across town. As the date approached, I found myself both excited and nervous. It had been years since I'd attended any kind of formal event, and I wanted to make sure I did everything right. I didn't want to embarrass Jasmine or her family by showing up unprepared. I spent an entire afternoon going through my closet, which didn't take long since I don't own many clothes. Most of what I have is practical: jeans, simple blouses, comfortable shoes for walking. But tucked away in the very back, I found a navy blue dress I'd bought years ago for a job interview. It was nothing fancy, just a simple A-line dress with 3/4 sleeves, but it was the nicest thing I owned. I tried it on and looked at myself in the mirror. It would have to do. The next challenge was finding an appropriate wedding gift. I walked through 3 different stores, feeling more overwhelmed each time. Everything seemed either too expensive or too cheap, too personal or too impersonal. I finally settled on a modest set of kitchen towels and a matching recipe box. Practical, but hopefully something a young couple could use in their new home together. I spent more than I usually would on a gift, but it felt important to give something meaningful. As I wrapped the gift that Friday night, I couldn't help but wonder what the other guests would be like. Sophia had mentioned that Ethan's family was well off, and I'd seen some of the expensive cars that had been visiting the apartment lately, probably relatives arriving for the wedding. I told myself it didn't matter, that everyone was there for the same reason, to celebrate Jasmine and Ethan's love. But deep down, I knew I'd probably feel out of place among people who were used to finer things than I was. I've always been a private person by nature. I don't talk about my past, my family, or my personal life with anyone. It's not that I'm hiding anything terrible. I just find it easier to keep things simple. When people don't know much about you, they can't make assumptions or ask uncomfortable questions. So I was content to be the quiet neighbor who showed up with a modest gift and best wishes for the happy couple. The wedding venue was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. As my taxi pulled up to the entrance, I had to double-check the address to make sure we were in the right place. The building looked like something out of a fairy tale, all white stone and elegant arches, with perfectly manicured gardens stretching out on both sides. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, Mercedes, BMWs, even a few vehicles I couldn't identify but knew must cost more than most people make in a year. I paid the taxi driver and stood for a moment, clutching my small purse and the wrapped gift. Other guests were walking up the stone steps to the entrance, and I couldn't help but notice how effortlessly elegant everyone looked. The women wore designer dresses and carried expensive handbags, their jewelry catching the afternoon sunlight. The men were dressed in perfectly tailored suits that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I looked down at my navy blue dress and felt suddenly self-conscious. But I took a deep breath and reminded myself why I was there. This wasn't about me or how I compared to other guests. This was about Jasmine, about celebrating her happiness on one of the most important days of her life. I straightened my shoulders and walked up those stone steps with as much confidence as I could manage. The inside of the venue was even more breathtaking than the outside. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, casting warm light over everything. Fresh flowers were arranged in massive displays that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Servers in crisp uniforms moved through the crowd, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres on silver trays. Everything was perfect, elegant, and expensive. I found my way to the guest book table and signed my name in careful script, then looked around for familiar faces. I spotted Sophia across the room, looking beautiful in a burgundy dress, talking animatedly with what appeared to be Ethan's family. She caught my eye and waved, her face lighting up with genuine happiness to see me there. As I made my way through the crowd, I tried to blend in as much as possible. A few people nodded politely when we made eye contact, but most were absorbed in their own conversations. I caught snippets of talk about vacation homes in the Hamptons, new business ventures, and country club events. I smiled and nodded when appropriate, but mostly I just listened, feeling more and more like an outsider looking in. That's when I first saw her, the woman who would change everything about my quiet, simple life. She was standing near the bar, commanding attention from everyone around her, tall and imposing with perfectly styled gray hair and wearing a dress that probably cost more than my car. Her jewelry was subtle but clearly expensive, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money or status. This was Victoria, Ethan's mother, and the moment our eyes met across that crowded room, I knew she had already decided she didn't like me. Her gaze swept over my simple dress, my modest jewelry, my carefully styled but clearly homemade hair, and I watched as her expression shifted from polite interest to cool disapproval. She whispered something to the woman standing next to her, and they both looked in my direction with barely concealed disdain. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment, but I forced myself to stay calm. I was here as Jasmine's guest, and I had every right to be at this wedding. I wouldn't let one person's judgment ruin what should have been a beautiful day. But as Victoria continued to stare at me with that cold, calculating look, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much worse to come. The ceremony itself was beautiful, even though I spent most of it feeling Victoria's disapproving stare burning into the back of my neck. I was seated toward the middle of the crowd, surrounded by guests who whispered among themselves about business deals and charity galas. Every few minutes, I'd catch snippets of conversation about people and places I'd never heard of, reminding me just how different my world was from theirs. During the reception, Victoria's behavior became impossible to ignore. She made her rounds through the crowd like a queen holding court, and every time she passed near me, I heard the subtle digs. Some people really don't understand dress codes. she murmured to her friend, loud enough for me to hear. When I placed my modest gift on the table with the others, she glanced at it with obvious disdain. "How thoughtful," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Her friends began to follow her lead. I overheard one woman ask, "Who invited the help?" while looking directly at me. Another made a comment about how some people just don't know their place. Each comment felt like a small cut, but I kept my composure. I reminded myself that their behavior said more about them than it did about me. Jasmine was having the perfect wedding day, and that's all that mattered. But Victoria wasn't finished. As the evening progressed, her comments became bolder, louder, more direct. She questioned Sophia about why that woman was there, speaking as if I couldn't hear every word. She made jokes about charity cases and wedding crashers. I watched other guests begin to shift uncomfortably, some looking embarrassed by her behavior, but none brave enough to speak up against the mother of the groom. The moment that changed everything happened near the gift table. I had been standing quietly, watching the newlyweds dance their first dance as husband and wife, when Victoria approached me directly for the first time that evening. Her face was flushed from champagne, and her eyes held a cruel glint that made my stomach turn. "Excuse me," she said loudly, drawing the attention of nearby guests. "I couldn't help but notice your contribution to the gift table." She gestured toward my carefully wrapped present with disgust. "Kitchen towels? Really? To a wedding at a venue like this?" Her voice carried across the room, and I felt dozens of eyes turned toward us. I tried to keep my voice steady. "It's something practical that I thought the young couple could use," I said quietly, hoping to diffuse the situation. But Victoria had no intention of letting this go quietly. She laughed, a harsh sound that made several people flinch. "Practical," she repeated mockingly. "Do you have any idea what the other gifts cost? The crystal vase alone was worth more than, well, more than someone like you could probably afford in a year." The crowd around us had grown silent, everyone watching this public spectacle unfold. "Someone like me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I felt the familiar heat of humiliation rising in my cheeks. But something else was building too, a quiet anger that I'd kept buried for too long. Victoria stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper that somehow still carried to every corner of the room. "Yes, someone like you. A nobody, a charity case who doesn't belong here, who clearly doesn't understand what appropriate means." She gestured dismissively at my dress, my hair, everything about me. "You're embarrassing yourself and everyone else by pretending you fit in with people of class." That's when it happened. Victoria raised her hand and slapped me across the face, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent reception hall like a gunshot. The force of it snapped my head to the side, and I felt the sting spread across my cheek like fire. For a moment, the entire room was frozen in shocked silence. I stood there, my hand instinctively rising to touch my burning cheek, trying to process what had just happened. Victoria stood before me, her chest heaving with righteous anger, clearly satisfied with her public humiliation of the woman who had dared to attend her son's wedding without proper credentials. The guests around us began to murmur, some shocked, others uncomfortable, but most just curious to see what would happen next. I saw Jasmine's face across the room, her expression horrified and embarrassed. Her new husband looked equally mortified, but neither of them moved to intervene. Sophia was pushing through the crowd toward us, her face a mask of fury, but she was too far away to have stopped what had already happened. Victoria wasn't finished. "Maybe now you'll understand," she continued, her voice carrying that same cruel satisfaction. "This is what happens when people don't know their place. You came here with your discount store dress and your bargain bin gift, thinking you could pretend to be something you're not. But everyone here sees you for what you really are, nothing." I felt the weight of every stare, every whispered comment, every moment of judgment I'd endured that day. Something inside me that had been patient and quiet for so long finally stirred to life. I looked Victoria directly in the eyes, And for the first time that evening, I didn't look away first. "You have no idea who you're talking to," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the chaos of emotions swirling inside me. Victoria laughed again, that same harsh sound, but I noticed it didn't sound quite as confident as before. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. My fingers were surprisingly steady as I scrolled through my contacts and found the number I needed. The room was still silent, everyone straining to hear what I would do next. "Graham," I said when the call connected, my voice carrying clearly through the reception hall. "I need you to come to the Grandview Manor now and bring security." The 20 minutes that followed Victoria's slap felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. The reception had resumed, but with a strange tense energy. Guests kept glancing in my direction, whispering among themselves about what they'd witnessed. Victoria continued to hold court near the bar, telling anyone who would listen about how she'd put that woman in her place. She seemed to grow more confident with each retelling, as if she'd performed some great public service. I remained calm, standing quietly near the entrance, my cheeks still throbbing from the impact. Sophia had finally reached me and was fussing over me with motherly concern, offering ice and apologies for her future in-law's behavior. But I assured her I was fine, that none of this was her fault or Jasmine's fault. I just needed to wait. That's when we heard them. The low rumble of expensive engines pulling into the circular driveway outside. Through the tall windows, I watched as 3 black SUVs came to a smooth stop in front of the entrance. These weren't ordinary vehicles. They were the kind of cars that whisper power and money without saying a word. The first people through the doors weren't guests. They were 6 men in identical black suits, moving with the precise coordination of professional security. They positioned themselves strategically around the room, their presence immediately shifting the entire atmosphere of the reception. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen. Then he walked in, and the air in the room seemed to change completely. Graham moved with the kind of quiet confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from absolute certainty. His suit was perfectly tailored, his presence commanding without being loud. He was tall, distinguished, with silver at his temples that only added to his authority. But more than anything, he looked like exactly what he was, a man who was used to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. Victoria, who had been mid-story about her heroic confrontation with the inappropriate guest, fell silent as every eye in the room turned toward the entrance. The confusion on her face was almost comical as she tried to understand what was happening, why her son's wedding reception had suddenly been invaded by what looked like a small army of security personnel. Graham's eyes found mine across the crowded room, and his expression softened with concern as he took in my still red cheek. Then his gaze hardened as it swept over the crowd, clearly looking for the person responsible for what had happened to his wife. Graham walked directly to me, his security team maintaining their positions around the room. The guests parted before him like water, their faces a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and growing awareness that they were witnessing something extraordinary. He reached me and gently touched my face where Victoria's hand had left its mark, his jaw tightening with controlled anger. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still silent room. I nodded, placing my hand over his. Then he turned to face the crowd, his presence commanding absolute attention. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "I apologize for interrupting this celebration, but I understand there was an incident involving my wife." The word wife rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. I watched faces change as people began to reassess everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman in the simple dress. Victoria, who had been frozen in shock since Graham's entrance, finally found her voice. "Your wife?" she stammered, looking between Graham and me as if we were speaking a foreign language. "That's impossible. She's nobody. She doesn't belong here." Graham's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes grew colder. "Let me introduce myself properly," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I'm Graham Sterling, CEO of Sterling Industries." The name hit the crowd like a physical force. Sterling Industries, one of the largest conglomerates in the country, worth billions, with interests in everything from technology to real estate to media. "And this," he continued, moving to stand beside me, his hand finding mine, "is my wife, Riley Sterling. The woman you apparently felt entitled to assault in front of a room full of witnesses." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Victoria's face cycle through disbelief, recognition, and finally dawning horror as she began to understand the magnitude of what she had done. "Riley chose to live quietly, away from the public eye," Graham continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling the entire space. "She prefers simplicity to showiness, kindness to cruelty, authenticity to pretension. These are qualities I admire greatly, which is why I fell in love with her and why I married her 3 years ago in a private ceremony that made headlines in every major publication." He paused, letting this information sink in. "But make no mistake, their choice to live modestly doesn't make her less than anyone in this room. In fact, given what I've witnessed here tonight, I'd say her character makes her better than most." Victoria's face had gone completely white. The woman who had spent the entire evening lording her superiority over me now looked small and frightened. I didn't know," she whispered. But Graham cut her off with a gesture. "You didn't know her net worth, so you felt entitled to humiliate her," he said quietly. "You didn't know her background, so you assumed she was beneath you. But most importantly, you didn't know her character, which is worth more than everything in this room combined." He looked around at the assembled guests, many of whom were now studiously avoiding eye contact. "What you did tonight wasn't just assault," Graham continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man used to boardroom negotiations and legal battles. "It was a public humiliation based on nothing more than your own prejudices and insecurities. My legal team will be in touch about both the criminal charges and the civil suit." The transformation in the room was remarkable. Guests who had been complicit in Victoria's treatment of me were now distancing themselves, whispering apologies and regrets. The same people who had looked through me earlier were now trying to catch my eye, hoping for acknowledgement or forgiveness. Jasmine appeared at my side, tears streaming down her face. "Riley, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I had no idea she would. I'm ashamed that this happened at my wedding." I squeezed her hand gently, assuring her that none of this was her fault. Her happiness had been the only thing that mattered to me that day. Victoria made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Please, I made a mistake. I didn't realize. Surely we can work this out privately." But Graham's expression remained unchanged. "The time for privacy ended when you decided to make a public spectacle of assaulting my wife," he replied. "Actions have consequences, Mrs. Patterson. Tonight you'll learn what those consequences look like. Sometimes, karma doesn't knock. It storms in when you least expect it." And that day, Victoria learned the hard way that judging someone by their appearance can come at a price far greater than she ever imagined. If this story made you pause, if it reminded you why respect should never depend on status, then hit that like button and share it with someone who needs this wake-up call. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, true stories that prove one thing. Kindness is free, but cruelty? It might cost you everything. See you in the next one.